Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Post-Traumatic Growth and Resiliency. I'm Trevor Wolf, TTA Specialist with OJJDP Zentac, and I'm joined by my colleague, Eileen Lafergie. Before we get started, we do have a couple of housekeeping items to go over. This webinar is being recorded and will be available on OJJDP's YouTube and multimedia page. Closed captioning is available in the multimedia panel of the WebEx application. For optimal audio, please consider using the Call Me At feature, which is located in the unmute or mute button and audio settings. If you're experiencing any technical difficulties during this webinar, please feel free to reach out to myself or Eileen Lafergie, and we're happy to help you as soon as possible. Please note that questions will be answered throughout today's webinar, but mainly in the Q&A session. So please feel free to type your question in the chat with as much detail as possible, and we will be sure to address those as possible. A certificate of attendance will also be emailed to you following the conclusion of today's event. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you Ms. Michelle Sipple.
Hello, everyone, and thank you for being here today. My name is Michelle Sipple, and I'm the Program Coordinator for SHIFT here at the Innocent Justice Foundation. The Innocent Justice Foundation was founded in 2007, and we are funded by OJJDP. We're here to support ICAC task force teams and their affiliates in hope that we can provide some tips for them to mitigate their stress. Throughout our relationship, we have understood the heavy burden that law enforcement officers have to face, and we want to provide them with a space where we can have some tools to help mitigate their stress and normalize them asking for help. Today's webinar is part 4 of our trauma series, and we will be discussing post-traumatic growth and resiliency. I will now turn it over to our amazing trainers, Jean and Chris.
Thank you, Michelle. I want to welcome everyone and say that I'm really happy to be here. My name is Jean McAllister, and I'm the mental health component of our training team today. We always train with at least 2 trainers so that we are modeling what we talk about in terms of using social support throughout everything that you do in your work. And just to give you a sense of where I come from, I've been a trainer with the SHIFT Wellness Program since 13 years ago, I believe, at this point. So almost from the very beginning of when it existed. And in my life outside, I have worked with child protection in a domestic violence program for about 10 years. I worked for 10 years as a specialized trauma treatment psychotherapist at a program here in Colorado at West Pines Lutheran Medical Center. And then I also administered Colorado's Sex Offender Management Board, the domestic violence program for the state that set standards for and did training for all of the domestic violence program, and was the executive director of our Coalition Against Sexual Assault and the Title IX coordinator at the University of Denver. So what that tells you is I'm really old. I've been around a long time, but I've been in this field and feel proud, energized, really like it enriches my life over almost 40 years. So that's some of the stuff we're going to share today when we talk about post-traumatic growth and resiliency, because you really can do this work for a very long time if you take good care of yourself along the way. Chris?
Thanks, Jean. My name is Chris Carlson. I am the former law enforcement component of the training here today. Just a little about my background. I began my participation in the Internet Crimes Against Children Task Force back in 1999. And I started off as a forensic examiner. So I was doing exams of then much smaller digital media than you're dealing with today. But I was transitioned from that into investigations. So I was doing forensic exams. I was doing internet undercover investigations and operations. And then I was promoted to detective, and I was moved into what we called the Chittenden Unit for Special Investigations, which essentially was the SVU for our county. And I was a detective assigned there while still doing forensic examinations, undercover operations. I was now dealing with live victims, and we handled any sexually based offenses as well as any child death or fatality in our county. It was a countywide task force. So I was also a trained child forensic interviewer. So I was, again, all of the things I was doing with the task force, but I was also dealing with live adult victims as well as live child victims and conducting those interviews as well. Hopefully law enforcement isn't doing that anymore. It was really a lot at the time, but this was a number of years ago. Ultimately, I was promoted. I was made the director of the SVU as a detective sergeant. I was then a supervisor with the task force, and I was promoted again to detective lieutenant. And I was the commander of the internet task force for, I think, about 7 years. I became involved with Shift right at the very beginning. We had actually created our own wellness program because of an incident involving one of my colleagues. I should say series of incidents where he came to me after he had had some pretty devastating effects from the trauma of everything he was seeing. He was able to recover from that and maintained his positions in law enforcement. But I took it very hard. It happened on my watch. I was pretty upset that this was back in the day where you didn't talk about how you felt. You didn't go to a supervisor and tell them you were having a difficult time with the material or with what you were being exposed to. And it was at that moment that I decided that was never going to happen again. And with his help and some help of some mental health professionals, we created our own wellness program. And it was shortly after that I was introduced to the folks at Shift. And I think that was right around 2007, 2008. And I've been training with Gene ever since. So a little bit about and I do want to clarify, although the Shift program is designed predominantly for ICAC task forces, but absolutely by no means does not mean that every single thing we're going to talk about today isn't applicable to what you do in your daily career and your daily life. It absolutely is applicable. I'm gonna speak from my experience, which is as a member of the task force and a supervisor and all the things I've been exposed to. But it absolutely applies to anything, any job, any type of career for sure. So just a little bit about me personally. Throughout all of this, I've been married. I stayed married by the grace of God. I married a saint. I'm going to talk to you guys about some personal stuff today that I think is really important to be able to talk about, and how the job and the career impacted me. We raised 3 boys. 2 of them are out of the house. We have 1 left that's got 6 months left before he deploys to the Navy. And then we will be empty nesters after about 30 years. So one of the things that I wanted to talk about, and I know Gene and I have looked at the questions that have been posed, and there's questions in there about children and family, and I know Gene's going to address that, but I come to you from the perspective of doing this work while being married, while raising children, and the impacts that had on me and the things that the issues that it caused, and I'm going to talk about that a lot today. So hopefully you'll get something out of this presentation. Hopefully we bring something to the table for you that will enable you to grow beyond some of the trauma that you've experienced in your careers. And one of the things I mentioned that I use myself, I have no problem talking about any of the issues that I've been through. For a long time I did. Currently, for a number of years now, I don't have an issue with it. What I've experienced has been incredible growth, and anytime I can bring that to the table, so that anyone else might be able to look at my experience and say, hey, I've been through the same thing, and what worked for you, and how can I kind of navigate this? Then that's a bonus for me, and that's why I'm still involved in this. I successfully transitioned out of law enforcement. It was a long, not so easy transition, but I'm now on the other side of it. So I'm going to bring a lot of those experiences to you today. And the whole point of this slide is to just explain to you that this has to be a stigma-free presentation. If people have questions and they want to raise issues, this has to be a safe environment. We've spent far too long in our careers and our occupations being quiet, and not talking about the things that really bothered us, and not talking about the things that had an impact on us. And those days have to be over. They have to be gone. The only way we're going to make it through this is together, talking about the things that impact us, and learning how to address those so that we can, have long, prosperous, and enjoyable careers, and then have something on the backside of it, right? Because it's not just about your career, it's about what you do afterwards and how you live your life beyond that. So has to be free of stigma. Like I said, I'm going to talk, I have no problem talking about any of the things I went through that were very embarrassing at the time, and difficult to talk about. But hopefully, like I said, we'll bring these things to the table today. They'll give you some examples, and hopefully enable you to move past what you're going through.
And I'm going to talk a little bit about where we're going with this presentation and how it might impact all of the amazing questions that you all put in your registration materials. There were just a broad variety of questions from many different perspectives. And today we're really looking at specifically the development of post-traumatic growth and resiliency, not at the very beginning of being traumatized. And our focus, as Chris said, is primarily helping people who work with traumatized others cope so that they are not harmed by the trauma they experience and deal with every day. But always what we're talking about in terms of trauma can be applied specifically to clients that you work with. And when we have time, we'll address that. But if you're looking for really basic coping skills, we'll be addressing some of those here, but we have a lot of basic coping skills for early in trauma and how to address things like anxiety on the job and things like that in some of our other webinars that were a part of this series. And so we're going to post the links to the webinars that OJJDP has on their YouTube channel so that you all can go back and look at some of those other webinars if they feel like they would be helpful with some of your questions as well. So just wanted to let you know that. And we're really looking at today understanding that when we work with trauma, there is always the possibility of harm and there is always impact. And we have a choice given how we behave in our world and how well we deal with the trauma that we are exposed to. I love that Chris talked about, I didn't used to want to talk about this, but I feel really comfortable talking about it now. That's somebody who has resolved trauma, that it is not triggering to be able to address what the trauma happened, that the trauma feels like it is something that is a part of your past. And the other thing we want to move toward is the reality that when we adequately address that trauma, it can actually make us stronger and more resilient people and give enrichment to our lives and our relationships and our work. So that's our goal today. And we're really happy that you are with us on this journey. Chris, you want to go over our agenda for the day?
I do. If we could, there we go. So in a nutshell, what we're going to talk to you about today are talking about the possible impacts of your work. And again, I'm coming at it from a very specific perspective based upon my background, but please know that it applies across any profession and any background. We're going to explore post-traumatic growth and the impacts, right? The whole concept today is getting beyond. And I know there were a lot of questions about trauma and about stress. Really, today's presentation is about moving past that. And how do we move past that? And we're going to talk about that today. We're going to talk about the factors that support this post-traumatic growth. How do we grow beyond that? And as Gene said, I mentioned that, there was a point in time where I couldn't talk about the work that I did. I couldn't talk about how I was feeling. I couldn't talk about how it was destroying my relationships. Now I can. So that is in my opinion, is an example of how over the years, and it's not something that happens overnight. It takes some time, it takes practice, but that's the goal for today is what are some of the factors that will support that growth after you've been exposed? And then, how do we apply coping skills and some other things to promote that post-traumatic growth? Because the goal here is that, listen, we're all in professions where we are exposed to things. We're all in professions where we experience trauma firsthand or vicarious trauma, and it impacts everybody differently. Though there are consistent themes among the impacts, it's going to impact everybody differently to some extent. So how do we get beyond that? How do I go from how I'm feeling today, which is really crappy, to feeling okay with where I am in life, with what I'm doing with my career, with how I'm engaging with my family? That's the goal, is how do we cross that bridge? And a lot of it is based on recognition, right? When some of that, I see Eileen posted the links to some of the prior webinars that we had that really kind of give you the foundation for this presentation. If you haven't been to those, we highly recommend you watch those, because that really gives you the core to understand, hey, I'm feeling this, what is it from, and how can I address that to then move forward towards that growth component that we're talking about today.
Thanks, Chris. That's a wonderful overview. And I'm going to just briefly mention some of the impacts of our work. And of course, chronic stress, because I don't know anybody who works with traumatized people in any setting who has enough resources, enough time to meet everyone's needs and do everything you need. We often work with scarcity budgets, scarcity staffing, scarcity funding, all of those things. So stress is just a component of what we experience. Burnout really refers to feeling overwhelmed by your work and losing interest or passion or commitment to the work as a result of unaddressed chronic stress, typically. Compassion fatigue is something that impacts our capacity to feel empathy for others, to feel compassion, to connect with others, to kind of feel like we are part of the human condition in a way that's positive. And it comes from giving too much without replenishing our own stores in some ways, where we're not really paying attention to taking care of ourselves. And it's the kind of thing where one of the ways that I really noticed it in myself, and one of the flags for me, when my husband was alive, he worked in the high-end print industry, and he would sometimes come home and say, I had a horrible day, and it was really awful. And I remember one day in particular where I do expert testimony in child abuse cases and child sex abuse cases, and I had been reviewing a case about a child death. And I remember thinking, I'm looking at him and I'm thinking in my head, you think you had a bad day at work? You didn't have a bad day at work. You don't know what a bad day at work is. And I realized, oh my gosh, I am at the point where I'm feeling so traumatized by what's going on that I'm not able to do my typical ability to connect with others. And that can impact our relationships over time. And Chris talked about that earlier, but that's one of the impacts you see. Secondary trauma is typically the presence of specific symptoms that we might see in traumatized people: anxiety, dissociation, being triggered by reminders in the environment, being untrusting, scanning your hypervigilant all the time, scanning your environment, all of those kinds of things. And we'll talk some about how, oh, go ahead, Chris.
No, sorry, I
Oh.
was clearing my throat.
Oh, okay. I thought you were trying to say something.
I'll be better with the mute button. My apologies.
So we are looking at those things. There were quite a few questions about some of those impacts. And again, our other webinars really address those more specifically than we will here. And vicarious trauma refers to the broader impact on our entire being, our physical, our intellectual, our emotional, and our spiritual selves and our behavior in the world. So it's that sort of broader impact of vicarious trauma. And it's really important that we notice these things, that we're mindful of them, and that we work to address them. It's also really important that we don't think these are the only possible impacts of our work. And so I want to move to talking about the positive impacts of our work, because that's a really important component of where we're going. And in my experience, you can't go somewhere if you don't have some kind of roadmap, if you don't at least have a view that something is possible. And that's true for us and for our clients, for those of you who worked about asking about clients. And I don't think one of the questions was about developing resilience. Do you think we're belittling or minimizing the impact of trauma on children and adolescents when we say that they have more neuroplasticity or ability to change their brain function over time? And I think if we're saying you should feel better right away because you have neuroplasticity, that's a problem. But if what we're saying to people is going through the hard work of addressing your trauma, whether they're kids or adults, means you can develop compassion, satisfaction. You can feel connected to other people. You can feel like you have enough to give in the world. You can feel resilient, which is that ability to bounce back from difficult stuff. If we actually address our trauma well, we're better able to deal with more serious trauma over a long period of time. We actually get stronger and better at bouncing back when we address our trauma rather than trying to avoid it or stuff it or shut it down. There were several questions about compartmentalizing, and it's something we all have to do in our work. But when we do it consciously and intentionally, rather than as a sort of way of standard operating, and we undo it consciously and intentionally to address the trauma, it's much healthier. So that was a really great question. Compartmentalization is good when it's intentional. And think about the fact that you may be troubled by someone you're working with or a particular case you're reviewing. One option is to get triggered and just like slam the computer shut and run out of the room and try to go do something else. Another option is to say, whoa, I'm really troubled. These are the things I'm feeling. It would be helpful for me to take a break and move away from this material and maybe go get some support from someone. It doesn't even have to be a big, long talk. It might just be say hello to some of your colleagues and see how they're doing. One of them gives you control. It keeps you in your prefrontal cortex. It stops the trauma chemical dump. The other one is acting out of trauma response. So one of the things you asked about is how do we use these things in our work? And that's one of the ways we can use them. And post-traumatic growth refers to the ways that we change that are positive and strengthening and enriching as a result of addressing the trauma we experience in our work. It doesn't happen automatically. Like Chris said, it takes paying attention and addressing the trauma, staying with it. It takes feeling bad sometimes and knowing that that's a part of the process. It takes asking for support and staying connected, but it also is a real possibility. And when we know that's a possibility, working through the difficulty of trauma is less scary, less overwhelming. Sometimes we feel like it's going to be like that forever. And I know that kids and our clients often feel that way. But if they know that healing is possible, that recovery and growth is a part of the process, then they're a lot more able to stay with the hard stuff when they have to work through it. And so are we.
And I'll just add to that, Gene. I mean, one of the critical components, and Gene mentioned some of the possible impacts. One of the critical components to this is truly being able to recognize. Gene brought up, something triggers you and you slam your computer closed and run out of the office, right? Well, it's really critical for you to understand, okay, what was it that was the cause of that? Right? So that you can address it hopefully sooner rather than later. I was notorious for going into work at 2:30 in the morning, working until 8 or 9 o'clock at night, and sitting at my desk the entire day, or going out and engaging in whatever operations that we might have had going on, without ever understanding, why did I have a constant headache? Why was I angry all the time? Why did when I got home and all my kids wanted to do was run up and hug me, why did that make me angry instead of being happy, in those situations? So, had I known that at the time and more importantly, had I been willing to recognize those symptoms and those signs and those indicators, then I would have been much better equipped to address them for what they were and not attribute them to something else, right? Because that's what I did. There was always a reason that the impacts of the trauma that I was experiencing were there, and it was never because of the trauma, right? It was always some other ancillary issue that I was dealing with, and so I was never able to properly address it for a long, lengthy period of time. So again, I can't underscore the importance of really having a solid foundation in this to understand why do I feel this way right now? What is going on in my current situation, or what's happened in the past day or week or month, because these are compounding factors, right, that has led me to feel this way, and how can I address it in a way that's both healthy and productive to be able to move on from it.
That's so important, Chris. Thank you so much for bringing that up. When we understand what it is that's impacting us, we can understand how to address it. And that's the really important piece of paying attention in that way. It's also helpful to know when we need more support. One of the things I learned really early in my career is that I can tolerate knowing almost anything people do to other human beings, even very, very young human beings. But if you make me deal with something where an animal gets hurt, I am a raging mess because I didn't develop skills around that. And so I know that I need extra support when cases involve those kinds of things in for instance, domestic violence or child abuse cases. And I work with them differently than I do most of the cases I work with because I need more support. So that's one way you can identify what the issues are. Sometimes they're more complex than that, for sure. And we have another definition of post-traumatic growth on our next slide, which is the experience of positive change that occurs as a result of the struggle with highly challenging life crises. So it really is the difficulty and the struggle and the work we do that brings that positive change. Chris?
Yep, we can move to the next slide. All right, so what are we going to talk about today? The 5 different domains of post-traumatic growth. So where are the areas that we will hopefully be experiencing this growth in a positive way? One is personal strength. The next are new possibilities. The third, which was really important, I'll talk about this in my life, relating to others. I didn't. I think I've gotten a lot better at that over time. Another area where I really, really struggled was appreciation of life and appreciation of things going on around me. Taking a moment to stop and truly embrace the positive things instead of focusing on the negative things. And then lastly is spiritual change, another area that I've experienced incredible growth. It's just another area that is something that you can focus on and look at as an area that you can find something positive in, as opposed to, again, focusing on that negative. So,
Thanks, Chris.
oh, sorry, Jean, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, I think one of the things that is really important in terms of that is the range of ways we can be impacted and how it can impact every single aspect of our lives. It doesn't always impact all of them, but sometimes it shifts. I see a real difference when I've worked with young people who are working with trauma, whether they're cops or prosecutors or treatment providers or advocates. Often what impacts them more changes after they have kids. When you're a parent, children getting hurt feels different in some way. And so thinking about how it can be anywhere in our lives, and sometimes that shifts over time as we grow or as we experience different things in our lives.
Great, thanks, Jean. So one of the areas that Jean mentioned is this concept of resilience, and I really equate it. I mean, first of all, this is the good news, right? The good news is that, you know, there's light at the end of the tunnel. For those of you who are feeling like you are just so beaten down by what you're experiencing at work and by what's going on in your life, there is light at the end of the tunnel that you can experience and that you can achieve. And really, it's the capacity to work through or recover quickly from challenges, right? The ability to withstand stress, discomfort, emotional pain. You know, I equate it to training for something physical, right? Whether it's for a marathon or weight training or any of these things, right? The stress of the training is very, very difficult. It puts stress on your body. It hurts. It causes you pain. But if you make it through successfully, you are stronger on the back end. And using the marathon as an example, the idea behind training for a marathon isn't necessarily training for the run. It's training for the recovery on the back end, right? And you know, this is part of this process. And you know, I spoke about understanding the impacts so that you can address those impacts and move beyond them. Well, that's critical because it's going to do a couple things. Number one, it's going to build that what I like to refer to as muscle memory, right? So if I know I'm having a stress reaction at work and I know what's causing it, I can immediately start to address that so that it doesn't manifest itself throughout my day, my week, or my month. As I start doing that on a regular basis, and as I've try the different things, and again with some of the other trainings, we go through different things that you can do to offset the difficulties that you experience and these impacts that you feel. But as I go through them and I find out what works for me and how long it might take to work, then I can start to build a process around when I'm experiencing these things so that I can address them in the moment and get beyond them. So what happens after a while, right? After a while, I become much more resilient. I become able to deal with the trauma as it occurs, deal with the vicarious trauma, deal with the stress as it's occurring so that it doesn't go home with me at the end of the day. It doesn't manifest itself in negative ways to those around me, to my family, to my spouse, to my colleagues at work, right? So the whole idea here is that you're building something and you become stronger as a result of that. The very process of becoming more resilient is post-traumatic growth, right? It's the ability to get beyond the things that are causing the problems so that you can move past it and live your life in a more positive way.
Chris, I love how you describe that. And one of my experiences over time was when I stayed with and noticed what was impacting me and used specific skills. Sometimes it's breathing through having to sit with a client in horrible pain. Sometimes it is making sure that you're taking breaks to give yourself time to recover. Sometimes it's making sure you use your body to kind of clear the stress chemicals. All of those techniques are helpful. But what I really realized is when I could stay with what was bothering me and address it quickly, even sometimes during work with clients, what I started to be able to see was the incredible strength and resilience in the people I worked with. I responded to the Columbine high school shootings the night of and for every day 6 months after, and then the state wrote a grant so that I could provide training and supervision for all of the victim advocates that were with any of the families who got hurt, anybody in the school, and then also help train up the Columbine counseling program. And I remember as I was going through that, someone said to me, how do you keep just going, okay, I'll do that. I can talk with this group. I'll meet with everyone in the library. And I remember saying to them, I can see how strong they are, and they need to know that they were strong to be able to cope in this way. And it was really powerful for me to notice how much I saw the strengths in my clients when I was taking care of myself and the good things, and could help them understand those things.
Yeah, and if I could add just one more thing, one of the things that's important to remember, and what triggered this, Gene, is you saying, you recognizing when something might be happening, even when you're with a client, and taking steps to address that in the moment. Most of us here, and looking at the backgrounds of the folks who registered for the training, most of us here are in careers that are different than just about any career on the planet, because we have to have the ability to maintain complete composure during some of the most horrific things that you could possibly imagine, right? Whether I'm doing think about it from the child interview perspective. If a child is starting to disclose to me something horrific that a family member did to them, and I react, I'm like, whoa, that's horrible. What's going to happen to the interview? It's going to be ended, right? If I'm conducting a suspect interrogation and they say something that shocks me, or whether it's intentional or otherwise, and I react to it, that's going to change the dynamics of that interview. So, we've spent our lives and our careers bottling up the normal reaction that your body would have to some of these statements or these exposures. That the normal reaction that your body would have is a reaction that needs to happen in many cases. But when you're bottling it up time and time again, you have to be able to address that sooner rather than later, after the fact. You have to be able to address that, and understand that, if I spent my entire week bottling everything up, and then I go home and there has been no outlet for that, there's going to be an outlet for that, right? And it's probably not going to be a positive one. So, thinking about how you have to maintain your composure, and then what you do with it afterwards is really, really important. And again, once you start to formulate what works for you, once you start to figure out, this is the sequence that I need to do things, that's when you're going to start to recognize that resilience, and that's when you're really going to start to recognize that growth over time.
Absolutely.
All right. Great. So, new possibilities. So, I spent many, many years not acknowledging the trauma and not acknowledging the impact that it had on me. I buried my head in the sand, right? I was like the what's that big bird that buries its head in the sand? Anyhow, I was like that thing, right? I totally ignored it, blamed everything else for it. And one of the things that you have to understand is that, if you have the ability to get through these traumatic events and get through these experiences, you can change your core beliefs in a way that acknowledges the trauma, right? Acknowledges the fact that, hey, bad things happen. I'm going to be exposed to this, and I'm going to be able to move on from it without letting it completely define our existence and define the way we view things in life, and the way we view anything from relationships to our general worldview, right? It allows for new opportunities and possibilities that didn't exist prior, because we're incorporating that, and we see things differently and more broadly over time. And I can, for me, what stands out, I mentioned that I made the transition out of law enforcement. What stands out the most for me is looking back once I got out of law enforcement and recognizing that I had, not done the work that I should have done, I looked back and I could see the impact that it had on me over time. I was able to look at almost my entire career, and there were points in time where I could see where things were getting worse and getting worse and getting worse, and then there'd be some sort of, event that might help a little bit, and then they'd get worse and get worse and get worse again. Um, it For me, it took me leaving and getting out of the profession to truly recognize that, because even though I had these things in place, I wasn't practicing them the way I should have been. And it was until I got out that I started to really try and put these things in place, because, hey, I'm out of it. I'm not dealing with it anymore. I have to be able to move on. I have to be able to exist. And because of that, because of those experiences, it's enabled me to truly, I think, put the traumatic events that I was exposed to, that I still see and that I still hear about, to put them in the appropriate place where they belong, to not let them completely take over my existence and completely take over my life, but to recognize them. Hey, that is a horrible thing, very traumatic. How do I address it? How do I move on from it, while giving it the attention it deserves, but not letting it completely overtake me? So it's really important to recognize that, this trauma that you're experiencing can and should be part of your existence, but just in the appropriate way.
Yep. And I feel like I was very fortunate because I got to work on this and stay in the field that I love my whole career. And there were a couple of places where that started happening. When I was very young and I was a supervisor in a domestic violence program, I got to hire a bunch of new advocates at one point. I had hired them. I thought I hired great people. And within about 3 months, every one of them had been in my office telling me that everybody in the grocery store was either beating their kids or abusing their wife or something horrible. And I remember thinking, oh my, I hired a bunch of nut jobs. I don't know what I'm doing. And then I stepped back and I started looking, and I realized that people on our board felt that way. My colleagues felt that way. And I started saying to my staff, and this was before there was even language to talk about vicarious trauma, somehow this work impacts how we think about the world. I don't know why, but when that starts happening, let's talk about it. Let's talk about how we don't stay stuck there. And then I also had an incredible husband who could see when I was getting stuck. And one of the things he did with our friend group, many of my friends coming from my work background, of course, is he would periodically say, we're not going to discuss work tonight. And you guys don't get to hang out in this horrible stuff you do all the time. And he really would do that. And if somebody wouldn't stop, he would start saying things that would be making people react in small ways. And then others of us would see what was happening and start laughing, and it would let everybody let go of what we were dealing with and realize we don't have to stay stuck in that sort of, always responsible, always at work, always dealing with trauma mindset, that we really needed to back off and let ourselves have a break and have fun and think about the good in life. So I was really fortunate to have support in both of those ways throughout my career. So growing in relationships is really powerfully important, because one of the places trauma touches most directly is how we relate to other people. It literally impacts how we perceive people, whether we perceive them as safe or dangerous. It impacts how we interact with them. It impacts how we see our own role. Are you someone who feels responsible for everything, which I did when I was younger, and is not a really good way to go through this work? It will make you a little crazy over time if you keep feeling like you're the only one who's responsible or who can do it. And typically we see the impacts in those relationships on one end or the other. We feel like we're the only one who knows how to make it better. We have to do it. We have to finish it. We have to be the leader. We have to take on all the hard stuff. Or we feel overwhelmed and like we can't take on anything. So when you're on either end of that spectrum, you're probably having relational impact from trauma. And knowing that can really make a difference. And one of the things we often do is think we have to be stronger. And one of the things we have to remember is strength is asking for help. Strength is letting people know what's going on. Strength is reaching out to others and letting others support us. And that's really hard to do when you have that headset, like, I have to deal with all the bad stuff. I have to take it on. I have to be the one who does it. And it's really something that can impact us dramatically. So figuring out that people are not the enemy. Many of us go through life being incredibly suspicious of people because we work with people who've been hurt by other people a lot. And so we start making that as a primary assumption. One of the things I started doing in terms of my own life was remembering, like when I ran the Sex Offender Management Board, so many people were just profoundly suspicious of everyone in the world. And one of the things that I started realizing was I took very seriously the data that 6% of adult males have ever committed any kind of a sex offense. That means 94% of them are good people who are not hurting people. We sometimes need to remember that we are ultra exposed to the bad things in life and not as exposed to the good things in life, unless we're looking. When we start looking, we see them. But one of the things I started learning, I was working with a young prosecutor who said she was developing anger at men because she was working with domestic violence and child sexual abuse, both of which are more often committed by men. And I remember saying to her, I know you have men in your life you love and respect. She had brothers, she had good friends, and she said, I really do. I said, okay, tell me what you love and respect about 3 or 4 of them right now. And I said, do you have pictures of them in your office or inside your drawer that you can open up and look at to remind you when you start feeling like all the men are bad men? And she literally developed a little photo collage that she could pull up on her computer, not when any bad clients were in her office, but that she could pull up on her computer and look at when she started feeling suspicious or like everybody was bad. And she said it also made her reach out to some of those people and just connect. And then she could feel that respect and love she felt for those people. And it was an experience as much as the experience of feeling distrustful of someone who's hurt a child or sexually assaulted someone. So reminding ourselves that we need to structure the positive in our lives when we are extremely exposed to the negative can make a real difference. And staying connected to them rather than isolating is one of the best things we can do in the world.
So 2 things, Jean. You mentioned that 6% of males are sex offenders. If I was in a room of 100, I'd be trying to figure out who the 6 were, right? Instead of which ones are they, right? Instead of focusing on the 94, right? That's the shift that occurred in my life, right? Is that now, am I still do I still have some worldview impacts? Absolutely. Am I still suspicious of people on occasion? Absolutely. But generally speaking, what I've done is I've made the shift from, hey, you know what? There's 94 amazing people in this room. Yep, there's 6 bad apples. There's always going to be that, but let's focus on that 94. The other thing that I think is important is, and from the relationship perspective, again, I'm gonna go back to recognizing those impacts, because what I would do is, where is the safest place to kind of off gas, if you will, all of the negative stuff that happened throughout my day or my week. Well, it was at home. And who was the unfortunate recipient of that, at any given moment? Well, it was more often than not, it was my wife, right? I'm not talking about physical. I'm just saying, where I would go home and I would already be upset, and then something would happen, and then I'd get angry. I wouldn't talk for days, right? So what happened to me over time is I started to recognize, hey, she is not part of why you're upset, and all you need to do is say, hey, I need 5 minutes. I need 10 minutes to kind of release what's going on up here that is not rational. It's not making any sense. There's no reason I should be upset about that. There's no reason I should be upset at all. So give me 10 minutes to kind of process it through. And then as soon as I'm ready, then I'll let you know, and everything will be okay. But if she, kind of came at me before I was able to process that and take that time, it was always a negative interaction. So that's really worked well in my relationship, is being able to recognize, number one, that there are times where I just need time, right? I can't always be the strong problem solver. Sometimes I just need to take a step back and breathe, and then put things where they belong, and then I can engage in a reasonable, conversation and communication with my significant others. So, but that took a long time to recognize that for me.
Chris, my husband helped me recognize it, because what I would do when I came home really stressed from work is I would start saying, well, did you put the laundry away yet? Did you do this? I wanted to be in control of something. And he sat down with me and said, sometimes you are really critical when you walk in the door. What the hell is going on with that? And my first response was to say, no, I'm not, blah, blah, blah. And then I realized, this man loves me. I know he loves me. He really is asking a serious question. And I started saying, wow, you know what it is? When things are really bad at work, I start feeling out of control, and like I have to like manage everything. And that fell on him. So we changed, and he started saying, if I came in like that, he'd say, did you have a bad day at work today? And then I could say, I'm sorry. This is about work. Yes, it was really tough. It was, X, Y, or Z. And and we could talk about that for a few minutes, not details of the trauma, but just what was it that was upsetting, and what would help me relax a little. And sometimes he would try to solve the problem, and I would say, I don't want you to solve the problem. I want you to listen to me.
Yeah.
And he got really good at that. But we have to figure out together sometimes with people how to work through things. And if we let other people help us, if we listen to them, because it's the people who love us the most and our close colleagues who will see the trauma in us sometimes before we do, because it impacts relationships.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, so appreciation in life. Again, I talked about this in kind of in the when I was mentioning resilience, that it requires the acceptance of the negative impact of trauma, right? You can't appreciate things unless you understand the impact of the negative things that are going on in your life. It helps us recognize vulnerability and lack of control, right? I like to think of the concept of control as a complete illusion, because no matter what I have tried to control in my life, it doesn't take long to recognize that I'm not controlling it. I might be controlling other things, but I'm not controlling what I'm actually trying to control. So, recognizing that you don't have control over certain situations is really important. Appreciation allows you to recognize what is important, and clarify those priorities. I mean, you have to set the appropriate priorities and boundaries in your life in order to be able to move past this. And, uh, for me, what I had to do in a lot of the things that we talk about in our trainings, as far as how do you address the impact of some of the stress and the trauma, and what are some of the strategies that you can employ. These they all have to be intentional, right? You have to first recognize it, and then you have to intentionally apply whatever strategy you're trying to apply, whether it's grounding or breathing, or in this case, for me, it was appreciation. It was truly stopping for a moment and taking a look around and saying, you know what? There's some things I need to be appreciative of, right? I'm married again, somehow still married. My wife is a saint. Um, Three incredible children. I live in a nice house. All of these things that I have health right now. There are so many things that I personally can be appreciative of. And once you start appreciating those things, it really puts things in perspective and really kind of helps all of the negative stuff fade off into the background to some extent, right? And allows you to realign those priorities. Now, especially now, this is so important because we spend our lives. It was never like this before. I'm dating myself a little bit, but before cell phones, before 24-hour news cycles, we weren't inundated with negative after negative after negative after negative, with the exception of the one feel good story at the end of the news report about somebody's cat, right, being saved, right? We are, I would spend the entire day dealing with all of this horrific trauma and victimization and horrific crimes. And then I turn on the news when I got home, and that was the worst thing I could do because it was just nonstop negative. And then, these mobile devices, right? News alert after news alert after news alert, and it's rarely, something positive. So, it is a constant 24-hour cycle of bombardment because everyone looks at their phone before they go to bed. We tell them not to. Everyone still does, right? Everyone looks at it first thing when they wake up, right? Worst thing you could do. And it's rarely something positive. It's rarely someone texting you saying, "Hey, you just won $1 million." It's, the list of texts, things happening in your family or things happening at work or whatever it is. So the fact that we're constantly bombarded with all of this negative information means you have to be intentional about focusing on what's positive. Hey, there's 94 good people in this room. I'm not worried about the 6 bad people, right? I'm appreciative for the fact that it's not raining today, that the sun's out, and I can maybe go for a 5-minute walk in the sunshine, right? That's something to appreciate. But, and this is the big one, unless I intentionally focus on being appreciative of those things, it's not going to happen organically because you're again immersed in the negativity every day, all day long. So you have to, just like any other mechanism, any other ideas that we give you to address these things, it has to be intentional, and you have to do it on a regular basis, right? You can't just do it once and hope that you're going to appreciate everything moving forward. It's an intentional thing to do on a regular basis. We did one of the other things we did with our youngest son is we would have weekly meetings, a weekly family meeting. And the first thing that we did in these meetings is we had to say 2 things that you appreciated about someone else at the table, right? It wasn't always fun because sometimes my wife and I were coming off what we call strong fellowship about a particular topic. So it wasn't always easy. But what it did was, if we had just had an argument or we had just had a disagreement, it made you stop and say, okay, now I have to forget about that and think about some of the positive things. What do I appreciate about you? What do I appreciate about you? It was something we did in our family that really, I mean, we don't, my son's 18 now, so we don't do it anymore. But it was really something that helped us kind of realign with, no matter what was negative in the world and life, we had an opportunity to tell that other person, hey, this is what I really appreciate about you, right? So appreciation of life, again, intentional, regular. You have to make it part of your life, and you have to truly embrace it in order for it to be effective.
I love that, Chris. The idea that when you think something good about something or you see something good, stop, notice, and if it's about someone else, say something to them. I mean, one of the things we can do with these things that can harm us, is use them to send somebody a text that says, thank you for doing this, or you made my day. This was so helpful, whatever. And it makes their day too. So I love the idea that we stop, notice, and do something about it. Think about, for a model for that, if you have creatures, animals, dogs, cats, how they act when you come home. My dog, even if he's been home a long time by himself, is so happy to see me. And it just like makes everything wonderful. And he's noticing and acting on that he loves me. And we need to remember to act on those things first, even if there are bad things going on. So another aspect of our lives that can be impacted is the spiritual. And for some of us, that means spirit, soul, how we view the world, how we behave in the world. For some of us, that is deeply intertwined with religious or faith-based beliefs of some kind. For some of us, it is more connected to how we live in the world and operate. For some of us, it's deeply connected to our place in the natural world. So it can be any of those things, but it really is connected to the meaning of life and how we use what we've experienced in our work to enhance that or make our lives smaller. I mean, it can make us not trust people and not want to have people in our lives and not want to spend time with people, but it can also give us the opportunity to expand our lives, to see more. Our beliefs may change. It can be really powerful to look at how this happens one way or another over time when we are impacted by our belief systems. And one of the things that I've noticed about myself throughout my career is one of the things I do is expert testimony, and I do it regularly. And it is often a chance to get beat up on the stand by people who don't want me testifying and talking about trauma and how people are impacted. And there are days when I come home and I think, why am I doing this? Why am I setting myself up to get beat up? And then I remember one of the first adolescents I worked with in child protection. She'd been sexually abused by mom's boyfriend. She was on the stand testifying at 14. She had wanted me to come to court with her, which I did. And the prosecutor asked her, so when he did these things, did you consent? Did you consent to them? And the defense attorney immediately said, I object. She was 13 when this happened. That's below the age of consent. She couldn't possibly know what consent is. And this young woman, amazingly enough, leaned over the witness stand and pointed her finger at the defense attorney and said, I do too know what that means. It means if I said yes or no, and I said no. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, this young woman is so strong and so different than so many of the kids I worked with who didn't have a voice. When I remember that the reason I do expert testimony is to be a voice for traumatized kids and people who can't use their own voice or who don't feel strong enough to stand up without support. And when I remember that, it's worth taking on a fight. It's worth having a bad day once in a while because that matters to me. That informs how I live in the world. That informs what my work means to me. And so thinking about those things, what you believe in, what's important, how to honor the things that give meaning to our life, and to engage in those things regularly, whether that's prayer or spending time with people you love, or reading poetry or a holy book, or spending time outside watching the sunrise. Whatever it is that feeds your spirit, we need to pay attention to that as well as all the other things we pay attention to that are negative. And that change can really enhance our quality of life over time.
And you know, one of the things that I think is important to embrace, and you mentioned it, I think briefly, is that it's purpose, right? Why did I get into the line of work that I get into? Why am I focused on the particular area that I'm focused on? Because it's very easy to get embroiled in, as we've mentioned, all the negative components to it. Oh, you know, I arrested this person, but they weren't, you know, the prosecutor didn't get, you know, didn't prosecute it the way I wanted him to, or the jury acquitted them, or the judge didn't give them a long enough sentence, right? We can all spend all day long focusing on those negative aspects of it. But as Gene mentioned, you know, for me, what it was my purpose was doing just that, was advocating for the people who couldn't or weren't able to advocate for themselves, right? And you know, I took that very, very seriously, and that was what, you know, that was my driving purpose, right? You have to have one. If you don't have purpose, right? If you don't find purpose in what it is that you're doing, not only will you not be very good at it, but you're not going to be in it for very long, right? You have to have something that keeps you going, that's beyond, you know, beyond the high pay and the amazing hours that we all experience in our careers, right? There has to be more to it, and when you have that, right, then that can be, you know, your own personal mission statement, or your own, you know, personal thing that you think about when things start to get difficult. And, you know, going back to those appreciations, I appreciate the fact that I'm able to advocate for this child who would otherwise have been left. So to contemplate purpose as well.
Absolutely. And just a reminder that not every traumatic experience is going to result in post-traumatic growth. It may not happen that way. We may feel change in one or several places, but typically not all of them. And part of the reason not every trauma results in post-traumatic growth is, as we get stronger, some of the traumas don't impact us as seriously as they have when in the past, when we had fewer skills or we weren't addressing it effectively. Expecting post-traumatic growth as an automatic outcome can lead us to sort of deny the traumatic impact. And if you heard one thing today, it's you have to notice, you have to recognize, you have to understand how it's impacting you, and then address it. Post-traumatic growth comes after those pieces, not automatically. And that these changes can happen over time and subtly and slowly. Sometimes they're very big and very quick, but support makes all the difference in how we look at those. And one of the things in terms of my thinking about support, and one of the biggest shifts that I had in my perception of my career, I think, was I was debriefing the Colorado Bureau of Investigation people who investigated the Columbine high school shootings. And that was the first major high school shooting in the country. And my boss at Public Safety had asked me to debrief them. I took a law enforcement officer with me who was a great friend and colleague, and who knew how to do debriefings, because when you work with cops, you always bring a cop with you because you have to recognize what people need. And because I did so much work with people, I had literally talked to everyone at Columbine who had watched anyone die or who had been injured. And so when we were going through the debriefing, which took about 4.5 hours, I didn't learn anything new. I actually had talked to all of the people that this whole group of agents had spoken with and done their investigation with. And I knew what the evidence looked like because people described it to me in detail. And so I walked out thinking, you know, this was not as hard as I thought it would be, no big impact. And I'm walking across the parking lot with John, my colleague, and I start saying, I don't think we did a very good job. I think probably we really screwed that up. Now, to tell you how bad a job we did, people still run across parking lots to hug me and thank me for that 20 some years later. But I started thinking we did it. It was what, and I remember John literally walking in front of me, facing me and saying, "What is the matter with you?" Because he wasn't used to me acting like that. And I burst into tears, and I had no idea what was going on for me because I legitimately hadn't learned any new traumatic material. I hadn't. And so we sat on the curb and he talked to me until I could figure it out. And what I figured out was I was really okay knowing more about a horrible crime scene than any other therapist, than any other victim advocate, than any of the people in my role, because I had spent my whole life thinking the cops who are investigating always know more than I do. That was an unconscious assumption. And when I got into a room with 24 agents from CBI and I knew more than they did, it scared the you know what out of me. I was terrified. And then I realized I didn't know it alone. I knew it with other people who knew all of the pieces that I knew in different ways. But I really had to realize it's that thing about you can't control everything. And I'd been protecting myself from feeling responsible by not knowing everything. You never know how it's going to hit you. You never know what the underlying impact is. I was so surprised by that, but it was so helpful to me and made me more willing to ask people for help because of how helpful my colleague was in that setting. And in terms of post-traumatic growth, we're going to shift now and talk more about, rather than impact, what are the things that support post-traumatic growth? So first of all, it's serious trauma. So for those of us who work with trauma all the time, it might be a case that's different than ones we've worked with. It might be too many of the same hard cases that we're typically good at. It might be a mass disaster. It might be something like I worked with somebody who did murder investigations, and he had picked up an investigation of an accidental death that a teenager did driving a car. And so it was, he said, I don't know how to deal with this. This kid just made a mistake and he killed somebody. I know how to deal with bad people. I don't know how to deal with some good person who something horrible happened to. So it can be any of those things, but it has to do something that disrupts our belief system, disrupts our understanding. For clients, you see that, how could this happen to my family? How could my husband do this? How could my dad do this to me? It's like dads are supposed to be protective. Moms are supposed to be protective. So it disrupts something in our belief system. That's what John helped me figure out about my reaction after the debriefing. What did I believe that got disrupted? And it's having coping strategies to address intrusive images, thoughts, or triggering of the stress response. A lot of us find things popping into our heads at weird time, or we're thinking about things at weird times. Coping skills, a lot of which we teach in our other webinars, basic coping skills for how to get out of those places, are really important. And then we need to address the sticking your head in the sand piece, that dissociation that Chris talked about, which is literally not fully integrating or not fully experiencing some part of the trauma so we can suppress it or ignore it. So it's also making a commitment to deal with whatever it was that distressed us or upset us. And so knowing that we deal with it and that we develop coping skills. Again, whether some of those are breathing techniques or grounding techniques or refocusing or asking for support or paying attention to the good, whatever the skills are, that we understand we can cope with those things. And when we can identify the effects of the trauma and have skills to address and cope, we're much more likely to be moving toward post-traumatic growth. And somebody had a question in the questions you sent about how long after EMDR can somebody set post-traumatic growth goals. When I think about post-traumatic growth, I think more about what in my life do I want to enhance more in the positive. So not so much we're saying post-traumatic growth goals, we're saying, how do I want to live my life differently? How does dealing with this trauma, how has it freed me up to do things that I haven't been able to do as a result of the trauma for a while, rather than calling them post-traumatic growth goals? Remember, this is a lengthy and natural process that comes from addressing the trauma and beginning to recognize the strengths and the good things.
Right. And I think it's important not to be impatient, right? Because that was my biggest hurdle, was being impatient with the process, and you have to let the process work, and you have to be willing to put the time and effort into it. One of the things that I think is not that I think is the related to all aspects of growth and recovery is social support. It's one of the most critical components out there, is having solid social support, both from your family as well as outside your family, and having support from colleagues who get it is really, really important. But what's also important, and what I will, from my personal experience, is not to only surround yourself by the like-minded. And when I say that, and again, from the law enforcement perspective, the longer I was in law enforcement, the smaller my non-law enforcement group of friends became, to the point where it was non-existent. And I got to the point where all of my immediate close friends and people who I would go out with and spend time with socially were all doing the same thing I was doing. Well, that's fine because they get it. But the downside to that is that it always, no matter where we were or what we were doing, it always devolved into the negative, right? It always spiraled into, oh, command staff is doing this, or prosecutors aren't doing that. It always wound up getting negative. So one of the things I found out very late in life was that it's critical to have social support and friends and people you engage with who are outside of the work that you do, for a couple reasons. Number one, you can have a conversation without it always going back to work. And number two, they're the reminder that there are good people out there, right? Remember the 94 good people in that room? They're the ones who are going to point them out to you before you point them out. They're going to say, hey, look at all these amazing people in here, right? And that's where it can help with that shift. So having people you can talk to on a regular basis, I call it the 2 a.m. friend. Do you have one? Do you have someone you can call at 2 a.m. and they'll pick up the phone and they'll be there for you no matter what's going on? Really, really important in life. And it allows for emotional disclosure, right? One of the things that I never did when I was deeply embroiled in all of this that I should have done is being able to discuss what was going on with me. And you can do it again. Jean mentioned having conversations with her husband. It was safe, right? I can talk about it without having to give that level of detail that's going to then traumatize you, but I can talk about it, right? And I can feel okay talking about it. Really, really important to do that, to be able to have those conversations with people. Again, even if they're not laden with detail, to be able to talk about it and have that emotional disclosure. But in order to do that, you have to have that social support. You can't do it alone. I don't care how tough you think you are. Believe me, I was there. I thought I was, the toughest guy on the planet. Man, was I wrong. Was I dead wrong? Social support is so critical in life. And even now, for me, having a good group of friends, that some of them have similar backgrounds, some of them don't, is really, really important in my life. So very, very critical.
Absolutely, Chris. I feel like I've been in the same book group for 43 years and in the same women's spirituality group for 43 years, none of whom do the work I do. And so it's really powerful that I have that kind of support. And I had a husband who would remind me not to do that and didn't let me always talk about work, which was really, really powerful for me. And social support is the very strongest predictor. The presence and use of social support, not just having it and ignoring it, but using it, is the strongest predictor of recovery from trauma and post-traumatic growth. So that's a good thing to know. And another thing, we've been talking about, you have to work on it. You have to address it. You have to pay attention and engage with the trauma you've experienced. And this is just a short list of the components of how to cognitively process. For those of you who haven't done a lot with trauma, trauma operates in our midbrain. It's more primitive. We have less access to our thinking brain, cognitive brain, prefrontal cortex, and the ability to process and move through things so we can let them go. So it requires that you process, which means you need to do those things that are going to get you through working through the trauma. First of all, it has to be voluntary and intentional. Somebody doesn't force you to do it. And you're not doing it automatically because that's very likely out of a trauma response. You are intentionally paying attention to what Chris said. I needed to notice what I was doing and then understand why. Really important. You need to recognize how trauma has impacted your belief system. When I thought, cops always know more than me about a crime scene, or when I have thought, moms aren't supposed to hurt their kids as much as dads are, and I would have a hard time when I had a female offender client. Whatever it is for you that disrupts your belief system, for me, the worst one was if I worked on several cases where somebody in the system who was supposed to be one of the good guys did something really bad. And that's hard for me because it's like good guys need to be trustworthy. We all need to be trustworthy, and it doesn't always happen that way. So you need to recognize what belief got disrupted, and then you need to either talk with someone, write about it, pray out loud, or use all of those techniques because you have to express what happened. You have to express it out loud or in writing for it to really get processed. And it involves being in pain sometimes, struggling with something, struggling with the impact, struggling with how horrific the world can be. And then it involves your ability to create a new worldview. Somebody asked about how you explain post-traumatic growth to kids. And I had a colleague who did a beautiful job of this. She would say, you know, this bad thing happened to you. And that just happened. And we need to work on that and how that hurt you. But what's also true is that even though you might be a sadder kid, you're wiser than you were. You know more than you did, and you know more about how you are a good kid and a strong kid and, getting through this and developing skills. So being able to say to someone, there is a new possibility for you. You didn't used to be able to think about going to court and testifying without falling apart. And you already have done that. And you didn't fall apart. You did a great job. Those things are the things we need to think about when we're working through actually processing so that we get the meaning of how things shifted for us and we're moving toward new meaning.
Yeah, so a couple of examples, and you know, I've talked about these, but I just wanted to touch on them again. Personal strength, again, that's really important to embrace. I know, I know, and I truly believe that I am a stronger person for what I went through. Do I wish I came to the realization sooner than I did? I absolutely do. But, you know, what I went through and how I've learned to deal with it and the experiences that I've had since then have made me stronger and on many levels. And I'm so appreciative of that. And again, you know, it opens up the world of new possibilities because I'm able to put the trauma where it belongs and not let it rule my life. I can look at the world differently. I can focus on things, again, the 94 as opposed to the 6. I can focus on those positive things, and it opens up a whole new realm for me. As far as both socially and professionally, where you know historically I wouldn't have done you know most of the things that I'm doing now because of I was in that little box and wouldn't leave that little box. So really important to embrace that growth.
Absolutely. And in terms of relating to others, think about how that shifted for you. I pay more attention to the close people in my life. I spend more time with them. I stopped ignoring my family and make sure that I pay attention there, whatever it is, and recognize what you're grateful for. I am grateful for working with the most amazing colleagues throughout my career, the most amazing people in the world, I think. People who do work with traumatized kids, whatever that is, whether that's law enforcement or treatment or providing services in other ways or supervising them, any of that. I get to work with amazing people in the world, and that's an important component of post-traumatic growth. And then one of the last things to acknowledge is acknowledge the spiritual impact. Chris, you talked about the fact that you had returned to church and gotten more involved with your religious life in a way that really enhanced your life for you. And I have my women's spirituality group, and I know that I believe that there is good in the world and that those of us working to address the bad can support more good happening. And that matters to me very deeply.
Yeah, and just a quick side note. I mean, for me, the spiritual growth also opened up some of it, again, talking about the prior slide, new possibilities, right? I've gotten engaged, you know, involved in a number of different groups at church, and it's been phenomenal. It's enabled me to find those groups of people outside of the work that I had done, and to have those 2 a.m. Support people, and to be able to, you know, have true conversations with people about what's going on in my life. And that's really changed. I mean, for me, it's been a game changer. Whereas historically, I never would have even gone down that road.
Absolutely, really important. And so we reviewed and briefly the possible impacts, explored post-traumatic growth and what it can do for us, and the factors that we need to engage in to support it, and discuss how to apply some of the coping skills that promote post-traumatic growth. And hopefully we covered that well enough for you. And we have a couple of slides that have examples of quotes that represent post-traumatic growth. The first one is from Leonard Cohen. I love this. So ring the bell that still can ring. Forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Acknowledging the crack and the good that can come, that's transformational meaning right there.
And one more quote to wrap it up from Ernest Hemingway: "The world breaks everyone," which is true. And after some are strong at the broken places, right? And that's exactly what we're talking about: is the trauma happens. How do we get stronger and more resilient as a result of it? And there's a way to do that. And hopefully we've given you some steps to make that progress. That's
Feel
it on our end. I think we got some admin stuff.
Yeah, thank
Yes,
you so much, Chris and Jean, for such a wonderful presentation. You know, these are always provide so much information, and thank you everyone in the chat for your participation. We had such strong testimonies, you know, on people's experience with post-traumatic growth. So again, thank you for everyone for sharing. To wrap up, you can find all of NTAC's work at ojjdp.ojp.gov/NTAC. You can also reach out to us at our email. If you'd like to see some upcoming events, you can sign up for OJJDP's JuveJust listserv. So just like today, you can get updated on all of these upcoming wonderful events. If you have any TA needs, please feel free to reach out to us at or through TTA 360. This is where OJJDP conducts a lot of our TA requests. You could end up working with Shift if that's something that you need. And then again, this webinar has or is being recorded and will be available on OJJDP's multimedia channel, as well as their YouTube page. You can also connect with us through a multitude of online and social platforms. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and you all have a great day.